Recording in progress. Okay. And second. You guys are so quick to tell me I'm so tech savvy, and now I'm like, how do I share? Okay, here we go. Screen share. Okay, you see everything? And that's me and that picture. Okay. For some reason, I have Lisa on my person sharing, so I'm going, don't know why that is. So I'm just going to get rid of my own picture here. Okay, well, that's not nice. How do I take Lisa off of that and make myself the person who's talking?
I think that when it records, it will only record the person talking. So now I'm on it too, but we can edit this out.
I'll just see you. I'll see you there. Okay. Okay, so start time. So my name is Kimmy Noonen, and my website is kimmynatkims.com. So if you want to go check out any of the extra work I have done, please do that. So here's a painting that I just finished, and literally just finished. I'm going to come back to it, but I want to give you just a quick picture of the work I'm actually working on right now while we kind of go back in time and look at some other things that have influenced me. So from a conceptual framework thing, preparing for this artist talk was really interesting because I realized how formed I am by the Fluxus movement, which, if you're not familiar with it, was more in the 1960s, and Yoko Ono is probably the most famous person from that movement. One of my professors from undergrad was one of I'd say one of the core or second generation Fluxus artists in the United States, and he's passionate about it. So as I was learning to become an artist, I learned also about the Fluxus movement. And somewhere they just became a mesh to each other. And I was listening to the Lonely Palette podcast, which is like my new favorite podcast. And she did an episode about Yoko Ono, a piece that Yoko Ono did. And she described the Fluxus movement. And it was kind of like hearing something I'm very familiar with, but the way that she described it so succinctly, like just light bulb moment for me, because I realized that over the years I've been really tormented by sort of the conflict between putting work on a wall that just hangs there, or selling my work for a high amount of money, versus the democratization of trying to get average people who aren't specialized in the arts to understand art or to create an experience out of it. And I don't think it really occurred to me until this week that really comes out of that sort of core education that I received. So one of the quotes that she said is that the Fluxus believed a viewer didn't need a degree in art history to understand what they were looking at, and were committed to breaking down the barriers between the artist and the viewer. And that really succinctly describes one of the bigger conflicts of my art career, and part of the reason I moved away from painting for a decade. And then she also says, this is conceptual art in a nutshell. The way something affects you in the moment of the experience is the entirety of the art, which is also conceptual. If you want to take it up a level, I'm Fluxus in my core and conceptual in the next level up of me. And something I have been sort of wrestling with and thinking about and less and turning into more concrete ways is that moment of experience that I feel very passionately about, being the art itself. How long does that moment, how long can that moment last? If I create a painting that lives in a person's home for 20 years, can the moment of experience stretch that far? Or does it have to just be sort of a spontaneous, someone sees my art or interacts with it in a certain way, and that spark in that moment is the beautiful creativity? So that's one of the questions that I've been asking myself. So I have three sort of distinct bodies that I have sort of inhabited at different seasons of my life. And I think I've said earlier that my word for this year is integration. So I've been trying to think about how all of these three separate sort of styles of work that I make, how they might live together in one house, and how they might like share rooms with each other. So photography was kind of my primary professional output from 2009 to 2017. Professional meaning like I had a photography business and I taught digital photography as an adjunct professor and things like that. I made money doing this. So I'm going to show a couple examples of some of the pieces that I've made while I talk about it. I have kind of a photojournalistic style, and I did a project I called the Everyday Project, where every day, it ended up being about 3 years. For every day I made a photograph and I posted it on like a Tumblr page. But it was basically wherever I wandered, I was really interested in how my wanderings intersected the wanderings of other people and how their lived environments affected them and how my presence and their presence sort of crisscrossed each other, and how I could observe kind of from a separate perspective people living their lives. I really appreciate photography because it offered me the opportunity to sort of pause time and consider closely what was going on in a moment, as opposed to video, which moves at such a speed, at a pace. Time is incorporated into it, but in photography, there's a pausing of time and a real interrogation of all the details that are there. And also this shows sort of, I have a general interest in small gestures accumulating into a much larger whole. So like one photograph by itself is interesting, but 3 years worth of daily photographs feels like another thing completely. And it's something I'm really interested in. So my social practice is not really performance, not really installation, but kind of them. I call it social practice because it includes people. But it was my main critical practice from 2007 to like 2015. So making money as a photographer, but my art was this form. I literally only have one picture because I could talk about each of these pieces for 15 minutes easily, and I wanted to stop that. So basically I create conceptual boundaries around everyday activities like eating, sleeping, living in an apartment, talking to another person, like very basic fundamental life activities, but I try to create this structure around it where I can separate it from sort of the everyday rhythm of life and put it into a space where it becomes visible and we can look at it more closely and consider what's happening. So this piece is called 30 Days of Dinner Time. I had for 30 consecutive days, I invited 2 people at a time. It ended up being sometimes more people into a really narrow window gallery, and they just ate dinner together. But from the outside, you couldn't hear what they were talking about. And from the inside, they couldn't hear what was happening on the outside. So there was a separation of sense, which elevated our other senses like the visual. So the work is, I really don't want to make anyone feel disempowered, but I also want to elevate. I want to bring down any sense of superiority too in the pieces that I do, so that everyone is sort of equally awkward in these engagements. And it's a lot about control, about surrendering control, asking who has control, because as the artist, I create the boundaries, but then I do nothing while it's happening except document it. So the actual art part is enacted by people who have total control over what happens in the piece. And I just have to I just catch it. But on the other hand, again, I'm the one that put them in a box and asked them to eat dinner. So then I'm the one who has the control. So there's just a lot of give and take and tension there around who kind of gets to have the control. But I try, I want so much for there to be that bringing the non-specialized viewer into an environment where they can wonder, like, is this art? Am I art? Are the things that we do capable of being viewed as artwork, as separate, as interesting, as beautiful? So, and then that takes us to painting. So I had an undergrad, my undergrad thesis was in painting. And then between the struggle against marketable and accessible art that lives in a gallery that only other artists go to, that felt very separatist, and I didn't like that. I had that struggle. And then I also became a mother, and I lived in a small apartment in Chicago. There was no space for a studio. And I just had all sorts of, inner turmoil that I eventually went to therapy for and have been unpacking. So painting kind of set to the side for 10 years or a little more. And so this is a piece so I'm just going to show you like one piece from different sort of like an example of each kind of style that I do while I'm implementing my painting. This piece is a pivotal one for me because if you look at the date, it started in 2004 and went till 2018. I was not continuously working on it that whole time, but I did this painting in college. And it hung above my couch, and I like super hated it with all the angst that a person can feel inside about something, which should have told me early on that I really still was a painter, and I didn't hate it completely. But when my youngest daughter was taking her afternoon nap and my oldest daughter was finally in school, I found myself with like a 2-hour chunk of time with nothing to do. So I started pulling the couch away from the wall, and I got some oil markers, and so the purple paint that's on there and all the line work is additional that I started doing in 2018. And it was just sort of a warm-up exercise to see if I was still interested. And it took sort of this generic, flat, abstract expressionist kind of vibe. And I found myself kind of creating a place out of it. Like it became very landscape-like. And it was interesting to me to see over 10 years of not really practicing that I hadn't lost the ability to make art or to paint. I hadn't lost the hand or the skill or the eye, but I had changed. And the way that I painted was changing because I was becoming a different person. So this was an important piece for my process. This is back in 2006. These are called the Early Christian series. There's probably about 12 of them. I found some old book with full page early Christian art paintings in them, reproductions. This is an example of my redaction strategy. So you can see that Mary is all pink and has lost her body. And also I used a photograph of myself in the one on the left. It's a really early set of pieces, and I'm surprised still that I like them or that they're useful to me, but it was the beginning of me trying this to think about what happens if I remove the whole and separate them into chunks. Like I take a body out, we know that it should be a body there, and it elevates and creates a tension between the thing that works and doesn't work, or the disembodiment of them together. It also is the only explicitly Christian art I've ever made, because I am a practicing Protestant Christian. My faith is really important to me, but I've never really wanted to or known how to make work about that, which is a whole separate thing. But I feel like it's so separate that I've never even mentioned it to other people. And I think that there's a little bit of me that's tense about that. So I wanted to bring it into the conversation. I'm just curious about how integrating all of the parts of myself into my work, how those play together. So this is an example of my love of maps. It's called Kentucky, Tennessee, also from 2006, but I have made a lot of work about mapping, different kinds of maps. This is just one example of that. There was lots of different things. I won't show them all, but I was thinking about what it is about maps that's attractive to me when I was making this outline for this talk. And the interest of that desire to keep track of where we find ourselves is something that I find really interesting, like that, the desire to keep track of ourselves. And I kind of broke that down to a few other, like, how do we find our physical bodies in the world? A sense of directionality, like where am I going and where have I come? A fear of losing control. A map offers so much sense of like, I know where I am. And as long as I have this piece of information, it will help me find my way forward. But that fear of losing it, and also a playfulness of just letting yourself get lost and trusting that if you have a map somewhere, you'll probably be able to find your way out of it, but choosing to let yourself be lost for a while. I'm also interested in how we change our physical landscape to suit what we perceive our needs to be from an environmental perspective. And then also as a parallel, how we change our emotional landscape to suit what we think our needs are in a moment, and maybe suppressing things or overemphasizing some parts of ourselves to be what we think we need to be. The comfort of being findable in the world, and the confusion that comes when a map doesn't work. So a lot of the maps that I make are not really useful. I take a map that was useful and I just disjoint it, or I make some, insane mural-sized drawing of a person waiting for their coffee, but it over the course of 20 minutes, and it's chaos. I just map out their footsteps, sort of thing. So what happens when a map fails us? Here is a piece that I made. So I've jumped forward in time. This is 2021. You notice there's a lot of words. Don't feel obligated to read them. But part of the reason that I'm showing this is that I've been curious. This is an example of me, being interested in thinking about one particular situation while I make a piece. Usually my process is very intuitive and it takes time, and I think about any number of different things while I'm painting. But this piece was made after I watched the video of a police shooting last year of Christian Hall. And, it understandably just stuck with me, and it was just a terrible thing to watch, and the sound of the gunfire. And I didn't know how to process it. So I decided to just make a piece, but it wasn't a painting in a day situation. It was I came back to it for multiple days, but I forced myself to continue to think about that one topic the whole time. So it's something I've never done before. And with the elevation of Instagram in my life and posting my work on Instagram, I've been writing, a description, or not, whatever. I write about the piece when I post it on Instagram. And I've found a really interesting connection to when I sort of not even describing it, when I just write something related to the piece that I'm posting, it creates a lot more dialogue. It creates a lot more understanding for people who wouldn't look at this painting and be like, oh, obviously you're talking about police brutality, because there's nothing in this painting that would explicitly say that's what I'm referring to. But I'm curious about the relationship of text to the paintings and how they work together, or how they don't help each other. Yeah, I don't want to be too didactic, too educational. I don't want to illustrate or describe what the work is, but as an access point, it's something I just feel so passionately about. How do I create access points for people who are not otherwise trained in the arts to be able to come in and experience something that is very abstract and encounter it in a way that isn't necessarily the way I want them to encounter it, but they have access to entering it in some way. And that's something that I would love feedback on. And then this is from my In Style series from last year, something that I did for a little while and keep returning back to, but that's Selma Hayek. That's a woman, but she's actually Selma Hayek. I'm gonna give her credit for her image. But basically, I've been playing with how to do image transfers onto my paintings, and I've been using a gel plate. But the only way, I went through so many tests, and the best material that works is high gloss magazine pages. They transfer the best, and usually those are fashion magazines. So I just got an In Style magazine and started finding any reasonable sort of portrait of a woman or a person. They're almost all women that I could find. And I'm starting to transition into using my own photographs now that I've figured out how this process works. But this was a helpful point for me to think about. I've been thinking about my own womanhood, about my motherhood, about incorporating that into my work and not being that's a separate bucket of myself that I shouldn't talk about. How do I let this conversation that's in me come out in my work? And also, it's an example of the way I use textile fabric in the pieces that I make. And you may have seen some of them already, but Most of the fabric that I have was inherited from my grandmother, who died about 10 years ago, and I got it from my mom a couple years ago. And I would say that my family history is working class, very conservative, and there's been a lot of pressure of expectation on what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a certain kind of woman, a mother, a server, like the person who stays in the house and does these things, and what a woman's work is. So as I've been going through therapy and going through my own healing journey, like taking this fabric and using it as a kind of a therapeutic tool for me, like how do I take this inheritance that I've received that I don't really have a desire to hold anymore, but I don't know how to let go of it? How do I let that transform through this metaphorical, process here? So sort of holding the fabric and incorporating it into my work feels really empowering, and it also, I feel like, represents a broader topic of women's work, helping me to just reconcile to my past and hopefully to talk about larger topics on the same issue. This is an example of sort of the hyper-realism, I don't think it's called hyper-realism, but drawing fabric, basically, that I've started to do in the last year. And it has been a pretty significant help for me in terms of, it encourages me to remember that I actually can draw, because a lot of conceptual, a lot of abstract art over the years, a lot of using machines to make art, and I kind of forgot that I had this skill. So it's just encouraging in that way, but also really contemplative, and it's sort of like a ritual. So I can sit down and yeah, I feel like I could talk about this for a long time too, but just the idea of like using my eyes to kind of unknot things, because when you look at draped fabric, it makes sense to your eyes, but then your pencil is like, how am I going to make sense out of this? Because there's folds and there are ripples and there are shadows in 1,000 places, and I don't know where to start or where to end. So it feels a lot like practicing choice. Like, I'm going to pursue this route of shading potentially at the expense of the other route that I'm not choosing. And I have to become okay with making those choices and leaning into that. I need to give a lot of attention, a lot of focus, and just stay with this one thing, because if I move or if I wait till another time of day, everything will have changed. And there's a combination of the feeling satisfaction, I can do this, and also the inability, like, I will never be able to fully do this. I won't be able to give this fabric volume. I won't be able to finish this fabric, even if I gave it 10 hours. And holding the tension between those two realities within myself. Yeah, I feel like it's just a really helpful practice for me. And I've been incorporating it more into paintings as well as just graphite drawings. And then that takes us back to the piece I showed you at the beginning. I called it Memory Map 1. It's about 48 by 45 inches, 5-ish feet, the biggest piece I've done in a while. And I originally painted this painting in 2003, built the canvas, and then I painted it again in 2005. And then I've been holding on to it this whole time, and I went back over it, which from a professional standpoint, like, it's bowed and it's not the best thing in the world. But I really loved the idea of, there are scars, there is texture on this painting that exists, that an older version of me created. Another part of my timeline created that. And now I incorporate it, I excavate it out, I cover it up in the same way that we as people in our personhood go through those timelines of how we interact with ourselves from the past and from the present. Here's a couple of detail shots of it. You can see there's like an orange sort of fabric rendering there. Also some mapping strategies that I incorporated, fabric from my own personal life as a mother, and also fabric from my grandmother's line of time. But layering is really important to me. I think it shows the complexity of personhood over a long period of time. And it feels a little bit like a topographical map. There's evidence that some work has been done here, but it's like a very mysterious kind of work. And I feel like that is really representational of inner work and what it means for us to go through our lives as people. But I'll go back to this. It feels like an abstracted process map, bringing my past into the present and trying to unknot the memories of who I am and who I want to be. And it can be very unexpected, nuanced, wandered, and layered. And yeah, so that's kind of where I'm finding myself right now. So that's it. Thank you. I think I need to stop my recording.